People often ask me why history fascinates me so. Even though I call myself the guitar historian, my love of history goes past just music, and I find myself drawn to touch points and moments, and especially certain years. There's something about looking back on anniversaries of great events, like the upcoming 250th anniversary of America's Declaration of Independence in 1776. History is chiseled into stone. It's linear. That's why as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of 1971, I thought it would be fun to look back on this seminal year in rock music by the albums that were released and finally ask the question, was 1971 the greatest year in music history? 1971. Tricky Dick Nixon was entering his third year in the White House as President of the United States. Ted Heath also entered his second year as Prime Minister of the UK, as Queen Elizabeth II entered her 19th year of her reign. Apollo 14 would become the United States' third successful moon mission after the prior year's successful failure of Apollo 13 to reach the moon. The NASDAQ debuted. The Ed Sullivan Show aired its final episode. Charles Manson is sentenced to death in California for the murder of Sharon Tate and others. The Milwaukee Bucks win their first NBA championship. Interestingly, they would win their second exactly 50 years later, this year. Arsenal Football Club wins the Division I championship, later to double the cup by defeating Liverpool 6 days later for the FA Cup. Nixon would declare the war on drugs in June. That went well. Gene Wilder starred in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, scarring children's minds for decades. Apollo 15 becomes the second successful U.S. moon mission in the same year. On August 1st, George Harrison holds his benefit concert for Bangladesh in New York. A late September cyclone in the Indian state of Odisha kills 10,000 people. Walt Disney World opens in Orlando, Florida. D.B. Cooper jumps from a moving plane into history as one of the most mysterious true crime stories ever. The Soviet Mars 3 lander becomes the first piece of equipment to reach the Red Planet, but only lasts about 3 seconds before going silent forever. Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange is released in December, and McDonald's opens its very first store in Australia. 1971 was a year of many interesting tales, but it's not exactly a year remembered by historians as particularly noteworthy. From a historical perspective, the following year of 1972, with its many turning points in the Vietnam War and the Watergate break-ins, was more of a focal point, at least here in the United States, that is. But the musicians of 1971, for some reason, decided to release some of the greatest music ever to reach our lucky ears, and as we go through the albums of this titanic year in rock history, I think you'll agree that it has a real chance to stand alone as the greatest in rock history. 1971 would start off right with a number of notable releases, but we came into 71 with the number one album being November 1970's All Things Must Pass, George Harrison's epic triple album on the Apple Records label. That album would stay at number one all the way through to mid-February, when it would be replaced by the soundtrack to Jesus Christ Superstar. But released in January, Chicago would release their third album. Canned Heat would put out arguably the greatest blues album ever made, Hooker and Heat, as a memorial to their departed guitarist Alan Wilson. Booker T and the MGs put out Melting Pot. Proto-metal band Uriah Heep released their second album, Salisbury. Another notable January release was the debut album by Texas blues trio ZZ Top. And although it didn't contain any of their better-known hits to come, it put the band on the map quickly as a down-and-dirty blues combo to be reckoned with. Gibbons was hot on the heels of his being called out by Jimi Hendrix on The Tonight Show as the best young guitar player that he'd seen. 50 years later, just a few short weeks ago, we would mourn the death of Top's iconic bass player, Dusty Hill. But the top release from January was the final album from iconic blues rock vocalist Janis Joplin with the album Pearl. Produced by The Doors' Paul Rothchild, the album stayed at number one for many weeks and ruled the winter months on the Billboard 200. 1971's second month saw debut releases by Carly Simon and David Crosby. Prog rockers Yes debuted new guitarist Steve Howe on their third album, The Yes Album. The Faces released their third album as well with Long Player, but unquestionably the month's biggest release would be the second studio release by the legendary songwriter Carole King with Tapestry. This album would go on to sell 13 million copies and win the Grammy for Album of the Year. King was one half of the songwriting duo Goffin and King, who wrote such standard hits as Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, Up on the Roof, and One Fine Day. Other notable events in the month were a drum-off held at the Lyceum between Ginger Baker and Elvin Jones after the pair had feuded for months in the press. Teenage girls everywhere were crestfallen when Davy Jones left the Monkees, and an unknown British band called Queen would play their first public show in London. March was a bit of a slower month with releases, but there are still a few gems. Mercurial singer-songwriter Nick Drake would put out his second album, Brighter Later. Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones put out compilation albums The Cry of Love and The Stone Age, respectively, and Humble Pie's fourth album, Rock On, would be the last with guitarist Peter Frampton before he would depart for a solo career. Probably the most notable release from March was Jethro Tull's Aqualung, which firmly cemented the band into the prog rock genre and featured the timeless FM radio hits Locomotive Breath and the title track. The Allman Brothers would also record the tracks for one of the greatest live albums, Live at the Fillmore East, and the Stones started a quote-unquote farewell UK tour as they prepared to relocate to France as a protest against UK tax laws. Here we go, the start of the good stuff. April is chock full of amazing releases. So many, it's hard to figure out which one is the best. The month would start slowly enough with Elton John and CSN and Y releasing live albums, but on April 19th, The Doors would drop LA Woman on us, their last studio album before Jim Morrison's death, and arguably the best performance by our seventh forgotten fretmaster, Robbie Krieger. Only 4 days later, the Rolling Stones would release Sticky Fingers, which is, in my opinion, their best album cover to cover. Next year's Exile on Main Street usually gets tagged as their best, but for me, Sticky Fingers just has no bad tracks anywhere. It's just amazing. Then only a few days after that, we'd get two Titanic debut albums by the Doobie Brothers and Thin Lizzy. Another notable release from April was the James Gang's Thirds, which featured the Joe Walsh-led hit single, Walk Away. 1971's fifth month saw some more debut albums from the likes of jazz fusion group Weather Report, the high end of the CSN and Y supergroup Graham Nash with his Songs for Beginners, and from the Irish blues guitarist Rory Gallagher, recently departed from his late 60s outfit called Taste. Other notable albums released in May were Rod Stewart's best solo effort, Every Picture Tells a Story, featuring the smash hit Maggie May, Marvin Gaye's seminal masterwork What's Going On, and the soft rock smash hit third album from the Carpenters. But the most important release from May was the second solo album from former Beatle Paul McCartney called Ram. This album was caught up in the post-Beatles feud between John Lennon and Paul, and due to John's friends in high places at Rolling Stone magazine, the album was actually largely panned at the time. But fans have been rediscovering the genius and beauty of Ram, and it is now generally regarded as one of Paul's best albums. May also saw the high-profile wedding of Rolling Stone Mick Jagger to Bianca Demasius, with a staggering guest list, including the rest of the Stones, Paul and Ringo, Eric Clapton, and Stephen Stills. I guess there was no need to hire a wedding band. With June being another slow month in the record release department, there were still, as always, a few gems released. Emerson, Lake and Palmer would release an early album that strangely made it into my childhood collection with Tarkus. Joni Mitchell also released her best album, Blue, which features just genius-level songwriting. In 2020, Blue was voted in Rolling Stone magazine's list as the third greatest album of all time. And in music news, the Fillmore East would close at the end of the month with a final concert featuring the Allman Brothers, the Beach Boys, and Mountain, even though several albums would be released later this year featuring the iconic venue. Stay tuned. July would begin with the death of a member of the 27 Club, Doors lead singer and poet Jim Morrison, who died in his sleep on July 3rd in Paris. With the summer in full swing, the album releases would also start to heat up. The Allmans finally released their album that they recorded earlier in the year at the Fillmore East, but not soon enough to keep it open, I guess. The proto-metal band MC5 released their second and final album, High Time. The Moody Blues put out their seventh album, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor, and Deep Purple's fifth album, Fireball, was also released. We also saw a solo effort from former Cream bassist Jack Bruce. For soundtracks, Isaac Hayes and Stax Records would put out the seminal album supporting the timeless film Shaft. But in the rock world, the biggest release was, by far, Black Sabbath's fourth album, Master of Reality. For this album, Tony Iommi and the band went even heavier on some songs by down-tuning a step and a half to make it easier on Tony's injured fingertips. But they inadvertently taught thousands of then unnamed metal guitarists that deep down-tuning of the guitars created a sonic experience unlike any other. August saw some more Titanic releases. Alvin Lee's 10 years after would release their sixth album, best known for their biggest hit, I'd Love to Change the World. The Beach Boys would put out the little gem of an album called Surf's Up, which featured some of the last compositions that were holdovers from Brian Wilson's experimentation phase when the boys released Good Vibrations and the Smile Sessions. But the biggest release of August was the legendary fifth album from The Who, titled Who's Next? Featuring songs from an aborted rock opera follow-up to Tommy called Lifehouse, The Who's use of synthesizers on tracks Baba O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again was a drastic departure from their prior sound. One of the few albums that doesn't really have a bad track on it, Who's Next was unquestionably The Who's best release. September saw releases by Fleetwood Mac, the first album featuring new guitarist Bob Welsh and Christine McVie as full-time members. Interestingly, we also saw the second album by British pop rock group Curved Air. Why do you care? Well, Curved Air and Fleetwood Mac's paths would cross later in the decade as some members of that band ended up playing in the fake Fleetwood Mac, assembled by manager Clifford Davis to fulfill tour dates left open when the real Fleetwood Mac would temporarily split up. You can see the whole story right here. Three Dog Night released their seventh album, Harmony, featuring the hits Just an Old-Fashioned Love Song and Never Been to Spain. Uriah Heep's third album and second of the year, Look at Yourself, was released. We also had albums released from the Steve Miller Band with Rock Love, Santana with their third album, Free put out a live record appropriately titled Free Live, and we also got a live album from James Gang with Joe Walsh for the last time. But the month's biggest release belonged to another former Beatle, John Lennon, when his second album, Imagine, dropped onto the listening public. The album would utilize many similar techniques that his fellow Beatle George had employed in his All Things Must Pass album, with John also drafting Phil Spector to produce, and using musicians Alan White, Klaus Vormann, and even George himself as supporting musicians. As we all know, the album is forever married to the title track, which is probably one of the greatest musical compositions ever written. October was chock full of cool little releases as well. We would see Cat Stevens, now Yusuf Islam, release his fifth album Teaser and the Firecat on the first of the month. Frank Zappa put out the soundtrack to 200 Motels. Space rock legends Hawkwind released their second album, In Search of Space. The Doors tried their hand at a post-Jim Morrison release with Other Voices. Pink Floyd would put out their sixth album, Metal, which would become a hidden gem in their catalog with interesting prog rock experimentations. And speaking of prog, we'd also get the sixth album by the underrated Van der Graaf Generator with Pawn Hearts. We'd also get a pre-Kevin Cronin debut from rock band REO Speedwagon with their self-titled first album, but the big boy from October was the second album from singer-songwriter Don McLean with American Pie, whose title track would go on to define the moment that Buddy Holly and others were killed in a plane crash as the day the music died. The final sing-along chorus of the song featured a gaggle of famous names including Pete Seeger, of whom McLean was a protege, James Taylor, and Carly Simon. Oh boy, what a month. Buckle your seatbelts. The month began with the debut by future megastar Billy Joel with Cold Spring Harbor. On the 5th, Elton John released Madman Across the Water, featuring smash hits Tiny Dancer and Leave On. Genesis would release their third album, Nursery Crime, the first to feature new guitarist Steve Hackett and new drummer Phil Collins. Genesis' biggest rivals at the time, Yes, would release their arguably best album, Fragile, their first with keyboardist Rick Wakeman. Rory Gallagher put out his second album, a favorite of guitarists, with Deuce. Traffic would also release their fifth and best release, The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys. That album featured former Domino Jim Gordon on drums and former Blind Faith bassist Rick Gretsch. Humble Pie put out one of the greatest live records ever with Rockin' the Fillmore. We even got hard rockers Nazareth's self-titled debut, Carly Simon's second album featuring the smash hit Anticipation. But there can only be one king of the month, even with all these other amazing albums, and this one stands far and away the best of the bunch. Led Zeppelin IV, recorded on the Rolling Stones mobile studio at Headley Grange, unquestionably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, hard rock albums ever released. Stairway to Heaven, Black Dog, When the Levee Breaks. There is no filler on this album at all, and it may have the claim for the best album of the whole year, but I'll let you be the judge. Before you decide, let's look at the last month of the year. Month 12 opened with the debut of one of my favorite bands ever, Electric Light Orchestra, with their self-titled first album. A few days later, we got another minor debut, Wildlife, from a little band called Wings, Paul McCartney's new project, post-Beatles. English prog rockers King Crimson would release their fourth album, Islands. We would also get the best album from Beatle clones Badfinger with their fourth album, Straight Up, featuring Day After Day and Baby Blue on that one. Carole King tried, mostly unsuccessfully, to follow up her earlier 1971 release, Tapestry, with her third effort, Music. We'd also get the debut from the acoustic band America with their self-titled release. David Bowie would release his fourth album, Hunky Dory, which was a bridge to his future releases that would feature a more hard-edged glam sound. Hunky Dory, however, is often overlooked as a little bit more of a softer album and is one of Bowie's top few albums. Sadly, it didn't really get noticed for the gem it is until after Bowie's next album, Ziggy Stardust, would go nuts the next year. Just making it into 1971, at least in the United States, as it wouldn't be released until early January in the UK, would be George Harrison's massive triple LP live compilation from his concert for Bangladesh, featuring the amazing star power of players like Bob Dylan, Ravi Shankar, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, Eric Clapton, the members of Badfinger, Jim Horn, Klaus Vormann, and Jim Keltner. The album was a bellwether for live recordings and for rock fundraisers to come. But anyway, what a year. Man, this was a blast to put together, I gotta tell you. Even the little gems that were released in between some of the more well-known albums hold up to this day. Make sure you comment below on what your favorite album of 1971 was. Make sure you like the video to let YouTube know that other music fans would like to see it, and be sure to subscribe to the Guitar Historian channel for so much more content just like this. But I guess there's just one more question you need to answer in the comments. Was 1971 actually the greatest year in music? Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.